Welcome. I'm David McLaughlin, Director of the Courant Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to the evening session of the Symposium. The evening panel's discussion is entitled Proof in Performance and Prose. The Courant Institute was founded in the mid to late 30s as a graduate center for research and advanced education in mathematics. Work at the Institute has always focused on mathematical analysis, applied mathematics, and the computational sciences. During its 60-plus years of existence, events such as today's symposium are somewhat rare at the Institute and rather far from the norm of activities that we perform at the Institute. In recent weeks around NYU, today's event is being called, with a wink and a smile, Courant Institute meets Broadway. Be that as it may, we at the Institute are really pleased to co-host this event with the Sloan Foundation and with the Manhattan Theater Club. Before turning to the actual program this evening, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge some of the specific people whose efforts have made this symposium possible. First, in the planning and design of the program, Professors Marcia Berger, Sylvan Capel, and Charles Newman of the Courant Institute, David Shukoff, Education Director of the Manhattan Theater Club, and Doran Weber of the Sloan Foundation. And I'd also like to thank the members of the staffs of the three institutes who did an incredible amount of work to make this day possible. In particular, Carol Levine, Marcia Saito-Eckel, Jim Wildman, and Esther Rose Wolfson of the Courant Institute, Lisa Kurt, Director of Development at the Manhattan Theater Club, and especially Susan Cook of the Manhattan Theater Club, whose incredible efforts made the day possible. With those thanks, I'd like to turn to the evening program, and it's my pleasure to introduce Doran Weber of the Sloan Foundation, who will introduce the evening session. Doran?
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of the Sloan Foundation to welcome you to this symposium. Two quick questions before I make some remarks. How many of you were here for this morning session, just by show of hands? Okay, unfortunately, you're going to hear my remarks. Again, I'll try to make them shorter. And how many of the people here have seen the play? Oh, okay, impressive. This event marks the beginning of a new partnership between the Manhattan Theater Club and the Sloan Foundation to develop new plays about science and technology and to nurture playwrights interested in working in this area. For the next 3 years, MTC will serve as an annual home to a new Sloan Playwriting Fellow. This year's selection is Glenn Berger, and produce readings, workshops, and ultimately a fully staged play that explores science and technology themes in fresh, innovative ways, or portrays scientists and engineers in a dramatically compelling fashion. This relationship started, appropriate enough, when MTC sent us an early draft of a promising new play called Proof. So we're especially pleased to be here today to celebrate that play. The collaboration with Manhattan Theater Club is part of the Foundation's broader national effort to stimulate leading artists in film, television, and theater to create more credible work about science and technology and to challenge existing stereotypes about scientists and engineers in the popular imagination. We've supported 6 of the leading film schools across the country, including the Tisch School at NYU in this effort, and we're working with leading Hollywood producers to develop a new television series featuring scientists and engineers. And this weekend we presented the first Sloan Feature Film Prize at the Hamptons International Film Festival to a film called Songcatcher, which will open in December. And our message in all these efforts is simple. We believe they're wonderful, diverse characters and great stories that have gone largely untold, a potential gold mine for screenwriters and playwrights. And the question for you would be how many intelligent, despite all this rich material, how many intelligent plays or movies about scientists or engineers or mathematicians can you name? Well, thanks to David Auburn's proof and MTC's talented stewardship, we can now add one to that list. Let me now just thank our partners, the Courant Institute for Mathematical Sciences, for all their hard work, and the Manhattan Theater Club, and introduce Barry Grove, the executive producer of Manhattan Theater Club, who with his partner, Lynn Meadow, has for 25 years been a dynamic force in American theater. I think MTC remains the largest theater organization in the country that's devoted exclusively to producing new plays, and we're delighted to be working with them. Thank you.
I want to thank Doran in particular and the Sloan Foundation in specific for having brought us all together. Indeed, a unique partnership is represented here amongst very different kinds of institutions giving birth to today's symposium, and we have to thank the Sloan Foundation, whose support has made this event possible, and a specific thanks to Doran Weber, who championed the project on short notice from the very beginning. So thank you, Doran. I'd also like to add my thanks to Dave McLaughlin and his staff at the Courant Institute and colleagues for the vital and important role that they play here at the Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences of NYU in assembling such a brilliant and thought-provoking cast of mathematical and scientific minds for this event today. In our endeavor to make the day a reality, we've been truly blessed to find a partner with such intellectual sophistication, prestige, and grasp of the Academy. It is exciting for us, coming from the abstract and ever-shifting world of metaphor and artistic license, to enter a significant dialogue with some people who actually know with certainty what they're talking about. I have to say that I could have delivered that line with more certainty this morning before I heard this afternoon's panels, and I'm not sure whether it holds any longer, but I'm hoping someone will explain over dinner what happened. The Manhattan Theater Club, just to say a brief word, has indeed for over 25 years devoted itself to as its core mission, to the nurturing, development, and dissemination of new work for the American theater, both American and international in its origins. Housed in 2 theaters at City Center, we mount an 8-play subscription series, and more frequently than not these days seem to feel the need to bring those plays to larger audiences outside of our home at City Center, most currently with Proof and The Tale of the Allergist's Wife on Broadway, and those plays go on more often than not to be seen around the country and indeed around the world. But in addition to Proof, which we're here to talk about tonight, Tale of the Allergist's Wife, which I already mentioned, a class act and comic potential are on our stages uptown, and we encourage you to come and see them. But more importantly, behind the scenes, a number of other significant events take place. On Monday nights, a writers and performance series brings poets and novelists, Nobelists and Pulitzer winners to read from their literature. Our musical theater development program gives life to young writers' work in the musical theater, and our play development program gives life to young writers' work on the stage, including a program called 6 at 6, where the play Proof was first heard by Manhattan Theater Club audiences. Equally important to us is our commitment to education. We think of ourselves as a teaching hospital at MTC, and we're currently involved with 50 high schools in all 5 boroughs in a core program bringing the arts to the schools, working with young artists in our internship programs, family series, and most recently, thanks to lead grants by IBM and Verizon, through our TheaterLink program to rurally remote groups in all 5 U.S. time zones who will be, I'm pleased to say, studying Proof this year in Alaska, Oregon, Texas, California, Kentucky, West Virginia, Vermont, and Western Pennsylvania, among others. Those of us who have been here all day today know that this has been an exciting and fascinating forum thus far, beginning with What's a Proof and What's It Worth, and followed by Women in Proof. A big thank you for our skilled and insightful moderators for those panels, Peter Sarnock and Margaret Wright, and we appreciate their time and the time that all of the brilliant panelists have given to this event. We couldn't be more excited about this project because it goes to the heart of what we as a cultural institution hope to achieve. Art is about furthering our understanding of the world that we live in, and it is about effecting the change that follows from new understanding. The project we've entered into with the Sloan Foundation and that we have undertaken with the Courant Institute today, and with the participation of each of you, is about rekindling a spirit of inquiry both in our communal pursuit of knowledge and in the artists to whom we give our stages today. The impetus for that gathering is an extraordinary new play called Proof, which premiered to critical acclaim on Manhattan Theatre Club Stage 1 last year, and which we are currently previewing and shortly reopening at the Walter Kerr Theatre on Broadway with the help of 5 great commercial partner friends. Some of you may not have yet had a chance to see the play, although I'm encouraged by the show of hands we saw earlier. For those of you who have not, I encourage you to go. Proof's author, an extremely exciting new writer, is here with us on the stage tonight. I won't steal Michael's thunder in introducing him, but we owe the greatest thanks of all to him for writing a brilliant play that intertwines mathematics, art, and life, and for providing the ultimate reason for our gathering here. I also want to add my thanks as well to 3 people on our staff who you've heard praised before: David Shukoff, MTC's Director of Education, Lisa Kurt, our Deputy Director of Development, and Susan Cook, the Symposium Coordinator. Thanks also to NYU and especially to the law school in whose auditorium we now sit for, as they say, giving us the use of the hall. And now I turn to my introduction of our moderator for this last very special panel. Michael Janeway is the director of the National Arts Journalism Program at Columbia. He's been the executive editor of the Atlantic Monthly, managing editor and editor-in-chief of the Boston Globe, and dean of the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern. His articles, essays, and book reviews have appeared in the Atlantic, the New York Times, the Tribune, and numerous other publications. I recently had the privilege of working with and witnessing Michael's extraordinary talents in the historic Second American Congress of Theater, which we convened at Harvard this past summer, and in which he delivered extraordinary summary remarks, a keynote speech at the end of an extraordinary weekend. He's an incisive thinker, a remarkable communicator, and we're lucky to have him here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Janeway.
Thank you very much, Barry. We're here to talk about representations of proof, or of what works in performance and in prose, in art. Let me begin by introducing our distinguished panel. Sylvia Nash, sitting right there, raise your hand, is the author of a beautiful book called A Beautiful Mind, a biography of John Forbes Nash, Jr., who was a 1994 Nobel laureate in economics, following his astounding recovery from decades of severe mental illness. A Beautiful Mind was published to great praise 2 years ago. Sylvia Nazer has been an economics correspondent for the New York Times and has just become my colleague at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism as the holder of the John S. and James L. Knight Chair in Business Journalism. And in other news, A Beautiful Mind is shortly to be made into what in Hollywood we call a major motion picture featuring Russell Crowe as John Nash. Can't wait. Rebecca Goldstein is the author of another beautiful book called Properties of Light, a novel of love, betrayal, and quantum physics, which the New York Times called a novel of cool grace and dark lyricism, lit by the improbable fire of physics and its improbable cosmologies, and colored too by poetry and mysticism. Rebecca previously published several other novels, including The Mind-Body Problem, which in particular caused a lot got a lot of attention and strong response. She holds a PhD in philosophy from Princeton and has been a MacArthur Foundation Fellow. David Auburn, right here, is the author of Proof, now in previews. I can hold up the program. After its successful run off-Broadway at the Manhattan Theatre Club. Bruce Weber of the New York Times wrote that Proof turns the esoteric world of higher mathematics literally into a back porch drama, one that is as accessible and compelling as a detective story. Mr. Auburn's past work includes the plays Skyscraper, Fifth Planet, The Next Life, and What Do You Believe About the Future, which ran in Harper's Magazine He's the recipient of the Helen Merrill Playwriting Award and a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship. And Ben Shankman, to our left, who plays the young mathematician Hal in Proof, has a long list of theater, film, and TV credits, including Terence Rattigan's The Deep Blue Sea at the Roundabout, Vanessa Redgrave's production of Antony and Cleopatra at the Public Theater, the films Pi, which I'd like to come back to in a few minutes, Quiz Show, and Jesus' Son, among others. Mr. Shankman is a graduate of Brown University and NYU's MFA acting program. Welcome home. Of his work in Proof, Bruce Weber wrote, "Mr. Shankman wonderfully evokes the hesitant charm of a young man whose self-awareness tells him that he is more than brainy, but less than suave." My job is to suggest a couple of themes that the panel might want to engage with, and we'll try to allow some time for questions at the end. The non-scientific among us, I'll speak for myself here anyway, may think when we're not thinking too hard about science and scientists as being relentlessly logical and plodding, methodically working out equations and formulae, the geeks and nerds and Dilberts in the lines from Proof in the program, which Ben Shankman delivers about himself and the like-minded. But in fact, and in art, the great archetypes and cultural myths are rather different. Marlowe's Faust, a savant who's into necromancy and the 7 deadly sins on the side, says, "Emperors and kings are but obeyed in their several provinces, nor can they raise the wind or rend the clouds. But a sound magician is a mighty god." In Shakespeare's Tempest, the savage Caliban says to his blackguard accomplices about the enlightened Prospero, a kind of master of learning and something of a magician, "Remember first to possess his books, for without them he's but a sot, as I am, nor hath one spirit to command." J. Robert Oppenheimer said of the first explosion of the atomic bomb in New Mexico, "We knew the world would not be the same. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, 'I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.' I suppose we all thought this one way or another." There are other archetypes, of course, but these archetypal scientists, magicians, have secret powers. They're fearsome characters, superhuman to an extent that overwhelms others. That was then, anyway. By contrast, David Auburn and Sylvia Nazer and Rebecca Goldstein, you've chosen to write about rather more marginalized figures. Robert, missing in action in Proof, and John Nash of The Beautiful Lost Mind, and Stephen Malick, reduced to teaching physics for poets. Scientists with extraordinary mental powers whose genius turns early to madness or dust. And yet the awesome archetypes, Einstein and Oppenheimer and Niels Bohr and other giants, haunt your characters and haunt your pages. So Sylvia, Rebecca, David, as you worked your stories through, how did you think about these various archetypes, and what, aside from the facts of the Nash case, in which John Nash, brilliant in his youth, lost his mind, has reduced and marginalized the scientist in fact and in art from this figure of awesome power that we've conjured with in the past? Why this reduction in power? Who'd like to dive in?
Well, I think there are really two issues. One is how people see, say, mathematicians, and I think that in our culture, certainly, mathematics has for a long time been misunderstood as number crunching, and only recently, and thanks to plays like Proof and Arcadia and movies like Good Will Hunting, has the public perception that mathematics is really very glamorous and is more related to music and art than to number crunching, has that perception snuck into the popular sort of image of mathematics. But I think that certainly when John Nash was a young man arriving in Princeton in the late 40s with a one-line recommendation. This is a genius. Mathematics then was peopled by the Oppenheimers and Einsteins and von Neumanns. And certainly he, when he was 19 and 20 and 21 and about to soar as this great creative mathematician, he certainly thought of himself as someone with magical and kind of larger-than-life powers.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca, would you say that some of what's happened to these archetypes is that science is ever more mind-bending in its dimensions, and that scientists dare the gods more than perhaps in the Elizabethan theater?
No, I think they've always, dared the gods and been seen as doing so. But I'm wondering, it was pointed out to me that two of my characters, great mathematicians, or in the case of the latest book, physicists, burn out or are reputed to burn out. And I know I actually was one of those who attended the full day and very much enjoyed it, of Symposia here. And it was disputed by the women that this is the case, that it was said that this was a myth, that mathematicians burn out early. And this is, of course, of particular interest to women because we tend to start later in our careers often. So if women mathematicians burn out early, will they be doing the great work that their male pairs do? But in any case, I had read, and interestingly, David and I spoke about this earlier, we had both read G.H. Hardy's A Mathematician's Apology. I read it the summer after I had graduated college and I was going into graduate school, into a philosophy program, and I thought it was the most poignant, the most passionate, the most tragic story I had ever read. It's G.H. Hardy, I probably don't have to explain to this crowd, was a great, great mathematician, one of the great mathematicians. He wrote a mathematician's apology explaining to non-mathematicians the passion of the mathematician's life, the beauty, the drama. And he wrote it at a very pivotal point in his life. It was after his first failed suicide attempt and before the second, which was successful. And what had prompted it was the loss of his mathematical gifts. And it was the most heartbreaking story to me, that somebody whose entire, well, not his entire life, but the passion of his life was largely revolved around mathematics, had lost this gift. He says that he was one of the lucky ones. He lost it in his 50s, but he went through a sort of sad roll call. This one lost it at this age, this one lost it at that age. And whether it's a myth or not, and yes, I certainly would love to believe that it is, together with the women mathematicians, it seemed such a heartbreaking story. And so I guess this has influenced me, because the worst thing that can happen to a thinker, not just a mathematician, but a philosopher, even a novelist, is not to be able to do that work, to know the ecstasy of working at your full power, and to feel the diminishment of one's power is a kind of tremendous tragedy. So I guess that's why I've been drawn to this kind of story.
Mm-hmm. David, how did you play with these ideas of the scientist as great, powerful, awesome figure, then reduced in this sad and lost way as you played with your character?
Well, I think one of the things, I also read the G.H. Hardy book early on, and it was something that kind of informed my thinking about how math is done. And I think one of the things that struck me was Hardy's analogy with the arts. And one of the larger arguments of his book, I think, is that math is a creative endeavor that is not that different in a lot of ways from what literary artists do, for example, and that that beauty, aesthetic beauty, is not just a desirable quality, but a kind of way to evaluate how good the work is, and a way of determining if you're on the right track. So it seemed like math and science were good metaphors for the creative process that might, since they were less familiar to me, I thought they would be less familiar to an audience at a play. But I'm a little reluctant to admit that I didn't actually intend to write a play about math, especially after hearing this symposium today. But I started with this situation, what I thought was a dramatic situation of someone who was worrying that they were going to inherit their parents' mental illness because they were approaching the age when it happened to their parent. And so I was really looking for a milieu or a setting where I could put that person. And since another thing I wanted to do was to have people fighting over something that had been left behind after a parent's death, I went looking for the thing or the profession that could accommodate that. So in a way, I kind of came at math through the back door, and chose to sort of put the emphasis on the family drama. But I found out that math really worked well for that. I mean, I think even though it may very well be a stereotype that your creativity diminishes after 25, it is a stereotype, and it's a prevalent stereotype in math. So I felt, justified in having the characters worry about that, and I think it lent a kind of, I think that we, in a way, everyone worries about what you do, what do you do if you no longer do the thing that you really love, or what do you do when you reach the point in your career when you feel like you may not keep moving up in your career. So I thought that it just, all of the examples from mathematics and science worked to kind of give me a dramatic way to talk about these issues.
Rebecca Goldstein, Stephen Malick, her scientist character in Properties of Light, has a wonderful line. At one point he says, "Quantum problems are like Kabbalah. They're dangerous. They drive men mad." Ben Schenkman, you appeared in the film Pi, which is a wonderful story about story of math and the Kabbalah and madness. Could you describe your character a little bit, your characterization, and how you thought about this whirl of obsession and pursuit and madness on the other side?
I played a guy named Lenny who was a Hasid, who was part of a rather, I guess, fringy kind of sect that was consumed with the process of using numerology to decode what they felt was direct messages from God encoded in the numerical translation of the Torah.
Which John Nash...
So I met a few of those. No,
comes around in circles, John Nash, right?
Excuse me?
Sylvia, numerology and the Bible.
Well, when John Nash became ill with schizophrenia at age 30, at the height of his career as a mathematician, he stopped doing mathematics, and he became a great numerologist. And for many years, he haunted the corridors of the Princeton Mathematics Building, and he wrote these messages that kind of mixed politics and very sophisticated mathematics. The one that I am capable of repeating are Mao Zedong's birthday is 13 years, 13 months, and 13 days after Brezhnev's circumcision, things like that. and whole generations of physics and math students, would see these messages, which Rebecca immortalized in The Mind-Body Problem as the messages of the Phantom of Fine Hall. And of course, the tragedy in this, the sad part, was that this unbelievably creative mind now circled around in these paranoid sort of fantasies of conspiracies in which everything was determined and there was no chance, and every coincidence, every relationship, like between a Kremlin phone number and the Social Security number of a mathematician in the department and the telephone number of the Senate cloakroom, all this had significance. And of course it blotted out the creative drive that had produced the great mathematics.
One more question about pi. Did you think of, I mean, the piece is so, you could be in the Middle Ages, but it's very contemporary. Did you think of that about time? Did you feel that you might as well have been in a Marlowe kind of play in Elizabethan times? Or
Actually, that didn't occur to me, but I can certainly see how the result. One of the interesting things about pi was how truly unimaginable the final result was while we were working on it. It was really in the filmmaker's head, and a lot of its effectiveness is in the realm of what I would call pure filmmaking. It's really the direct effect of image, sound on the audience, and a lot of the forward motion of the movie and the emotion of the movie, I think, is created by that. And that's what I mean. It's pure filmmaking. Mm-hmm. Shooting it was like being in an incredibly ambitious and slightly dubious student film. I mean, to be honest, it was shot for no money and with none of the usual accoutrements of filmmaking. We were sort of hanging out on a curb until your shot was up.
It was a very cheap budget.
Very cheap. I only worked 4 days on it. For my part, entire part was done in 4 days. So. I wish I could say that I had the prescience to make the kind of connection that you just suggested, but I didn't. It was, I thought an interesting character, and then I had, very little hopes for the movie.
Ben, what inspired that story? I mean, there was a bestseller around that time called Bible Code, which was about tracing the numerology of the Torah.
I think that was just that was in fact a coincidence, which the director, who's as talented, has as deeply instinctive and talented a sense of marketing and sort of synergy as he does of actually writing. So he seized on that as sort of an indication that the film was destined for greatness. But I don't think it influenced him in the writing process, because I think he'd actually begun it a couple of years before the book became visible.
In The Tempest, Prospero says, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. That is, all is ephemeral." Rebecca Goldstein's Stephen Malick, who teaches physics for poets, says, "I have been thinking that perhaps the bard ought to be paraphrased to read, 'We are such dreams as stuff is made of.' You see, then we could assert that stuff comes from the collapse of the dream." Rebecca, what dream do you mean? Is it Einstein's unified theory, coherence at last, or is it something quite different, mixing your themes of the scientific and the erotic?
Yeah, he was speaking there about various problems in interpreting quantum physics, and was putting forth a poetic metaphor that I think doesn't make all that much sense. You can do that. It's one of the wonderful things for me in turning from philosophy, analytic philosophy, in which I had been trained, to fiction, that it was okay if my characters didn't make a lot of sense, and it's just my characters. But I don't know that what was he doing there? Yeah, this is one of his mad interpretations of quantum physics. We're talking about the collapse of the wave packet and what that might mean in physical terms, what that might tell us about reality. Yeah,
but he then gets into an argument, right, with just the young man, Justin Childs, about dreams and metaphors.
Exactly, because my character, Samuel Malick, was partly inspired.
Samuel, excuse me.
Partly inspired by a real physicist, David Bohm, and I explain in the afterword which ways Samuel Malik corresponds to David Bohm and which ways he doesn't. Everything, and it's rather a lurid story. It's a kind of, well, the publisher calls it a Gothic novel, and a Gothic novel of ideas. But all of the sort of lurid, scurrilous details of the triangle, which bears quite a spooky similarity to the triangle of David's play, but all of that is made up. But what is not made up is that David Bohm had put forth an interpretation of quantum mechanics in 1952, which, according to certain physicists, was given a somewhat hasty dismissal. And my character, Justin, who rediscovers this, is angry because the older man, Samuel Malik, seems to have forgotten the model that he had put forth, the realistic interpretation of quantum mechanics, and is now giving these metaphorical, slightly Copenhagen interpretations, which the younger man doesn't want to hear about.
In Arcadia, Tom Stoppard's contemporary mathematician Valentine speaks of the expanding structure of science in time and says of the question whether another character in this play, which leaps forward and backward in time, a young early 18th century woman student, the question whether this young woman's math experiment really worked, he says, "You can't open a door before there's a house." And Hannah, his contemporary scholar, says, "I thought that's what genius was." And Valentine says, "Only for lunatics and poets." But he's wrong. The young woman's theorem or proof does work more than a century before its time. And she had no particular formal training. David and Rebecca, the daughters of your brilliant scientists live in their father's houses, each takes care of their father. And coming back to this question of genes, they carry their father's genes of genius and perhaps of madness, as John Nash's second son, John, did. Their genius is apparently genetic and a matter of the house rather than of formal training. Is this the element of magic, speaking of archetypes, in the riddle of science and genius and madness, as it fits today, this riddle of the genes, this miracle of a reawakening of genius in the next generation?
Well, I've got this character who apparently, even though she's been to college for only a couple months, apart from that, she's sort of untrained, and she's meant to, she claims to have come up with a mathematical proof. So part of the play is about whether or not this is true and how reliable she is and whether or not we can believe her. And I felt that just as far as having a character who without a lot of formal training, claiming to have done something kind of miraculous in the field, that I was on pretty safe ground with math. And I'm only talking about kind of exceptional cases, but there have been, in the Hardy book, one of the most kind of romantic episodes in that book is this story about Ramanujan. I hope I'm saying that right. The Indian mathematician who had no training, who sent Hardy this book of results. They weren't even proofs because he didn't know what a formal proof was, but he had a bunch of equations that he had come up with, and he wasn't even using standard notation. He made up his own notation. So Hardy got this thing in the mail from India, and he didn't know, he thought it was from a crank. And it took him a couple days of thinking about it before he realized this guy wasn't a crank. He was the greatest mathematical genius he'd ever encountered. And he had sort of done it by himself. So that is sort of, I guess, one of the magical things about certain kinds of genius to people who don't have it, that this kind of solitary activity is possible. And that, to me, it's a romantic notion that I tried to get into the play, that someone working all alone upstairs in an attic could come up with something that really is kind of earth-shaking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And her sister thinks she's mad
Sure.
in the process.
Yeah.
in which you sort of tease up the question. To work like that, you have to be mad, or others may inevitably think that you are.
Yeah, and I was a little bit reluctant to draw a correlation between madness and genius, and I don't think there really is one, but I do think that, at least in the case of the play, I tried to suggest that for this character, because she'd been so intimately acquainted with her dad, who had had both extraordinary ability and madness, that she couldn't separate the two for herself. That the fear is not just it's not just her sister's fear that she is going crazy, it's her own fear more than anything else. And so that those, at least for her, those two things went hand in hand.
How about Dana, Malik, Rebecca?
Yeah, I just actually want to mention one of the things about the magical aspect of mathematicians in particular is the phenomenon of the child prodigy, which is seems so dramatic that you have these, they're not old enough to cross the street yet, and they by themselves, and they're producing amazing results sometimes. And when this, so there seems something quite unique and magical and strange and mysterious, that this kind of very mature intellectual ability can erupt in very young people. And it's interesting because it often does strange things to their personality. There's a great, I can't think of it right now, there's a great Russian mathematician, somebody out there will know, who theorizes somewhat in jest, but I think somewhat seriously, that you can tell the age at which a great mathematician's math emerged because the emotional development goes on hold at that point. So, it's so dramatic. Or maybe just that grown-ups around him or her are willing to put up with the bizarre behavior because, God, they're geniuses. So, but this phenomenon, which is, I guess it only really exists in math and music, is, it's just magic. It's amazing. And the question of madness and genius, I don't know. It might just be that when it's geniuses who become mad, it's so interesting and so dazzling, and it attracts a great deal of attention. Who cares about your normal guy becoming, mad? But when it's John Nash, it's fascinating. So I don't know if there really is this correlation. I mean, that's first, that's an empirical study, and I don't know what the results of that are.
But you do intend Dana to. She has the gene of genius.
Yes, she has the gene of genius. She says it takes the narrator of the book, Justin, quite a while to figure out that Dana is a physicist and a damn good one. And he just notices that, she's rather good looking, and that's what he's fixated on. And she says something like, well, I'm an only child. The genes had nowhere else to go.
The theme of this brilliance on the one hand and amazing arrested development on the other is something Sylvia has quite a time with in telling the John Nash story. I mean, these games, these stunts and practical jokes and level of humor and so forth is really sub-junior high school at when they are out there. Doing brilliant work, isn't it?
But in other ways, I mean, this is true that Nash was an extremely eccentric young man, but in other ways, he did not at all fit this, I think, very romantic notion of the lone genius, the child prodigy. In fact, he went to an engineering school, Carnegie Mellon, where he was identified as having tremendous mathematical talents and was then groomed at Princeton. In other words, he was no Ramanujan. He was highly trained. He had a very sophisticated sense of what the problems were, a sense that gotten from interviewing really the von Neumanns and the Gödels and the top mathematicians in this community. and thought of himself very much, and see, this is the other half of Hardy's mathematician's apology, thought of the enterprise very much as a competition. So in very social terms, that he was going to beat other young mathematicians at solving these really astounding problems. So it's so in that aspect, he was very sophisticated and very strategizing, and picked these highly specialized problems because he knew that solving them would make his reputation and have a big impact on their respective fields. And you don't do that in isolation and without a tremendous amount of training.
Let's talk a little bit about game theory at several levels. It seems to me all of you get involved with it in one way and another, perhaps most obviously Sylvia. I'm interested in the way game theory comes to us almost like a play, an enormous a drama in several acts. We have the drama of the atomic bomb coming out of World War II, and on Broadway we have Copenhagen by Michael Frayn, in which Niels Bohr helped build the bomb, the atomic bomb, and we're given the riddle whether his protege Heisenberg thought it couldn't be done and was a kind of dumb Nazi trying to pump Bohr about what he knew, in effect spying on Bohr, or whether Heisenberg was conveying that he would play brilliantly and courageously a secret ally and tell Hitler that the bomb couldn't be built when he knew it could. In other words, what game was Heisenberg playing? And just a few years later, Oppenheimer didn't want to build the hydrogen bomb, and at first said it couldn't be done. And Edward Teller wanted to build it and said it could, and helped destroy Oppenheimer's career as a result. So we got, in the mid-20th century, not only the scenario of nuclear war, but of destabilization and dark intrigue among the nuclear scientists. Game theory, which von Neumann, as you described, von Neumann and Nash and others worked out based on the theory of rational choice, applied to diplomacy and strategy, would appear to have rescued us from those kinds of breakdowns. And game theory is certainly a wonderful way to make a piece of art work. But does it work over the long haul, Sylvia? Does the conceit of game theory do more than save these mad genius scientists from going over the edge of hubris, as in Dr. Strangelove? Did it also save the world, or at least stabilize it?
Look, I think that game theory, which is really the sort of science of strategic thinking, it's about how to think about decisions when my best option depends on what your best option is. Game theory was used in World War II, in submarine warfare and bombing exercises, things like that. And then it was really very quiescent. It never really produced, it was a wonderful systematic way of conceptualizing about nuclear, two superpowers facing off, but it didn't yield that many concrete insights. In other words, you couldn't use it to prepare for the next round of SALT negotiations. But in the 1980s, thanks to some further developments, it really had a very big impact on economics, and particularly on areas like antitrust, et cetera. So, that was not, look, this was Nash's big contribution, which was in his 26-page PhD thesis, was from his point of view as a pure mathematician, a piece of juvenilia. He had this great insight about how you could come to a resolution in certain kinds of games when there are many players. But he was interested in the mathematics and that particular insight, but he regarded it as juvenilia. He was off to Riemannian geometry and other things, and he didn't really care about whether it had a big impact in the world, which it later did when the Clinton administration auctioned off the airwaves, in which they're about to do again, using game theoretic concepts. But that was not where Nash was coming from. He was interested in solving a problem that John von Neumann, who is, of course, the great god of Princeton and indeed the whole world of mathematics, that he had an insight that von Neumann didn't have. And what he said about it, in fact, which von Neumann didn't appreciate, and the way Nash in the 1990s, this is after his 30 years of schizophrenia and his miraculous recovery, what he said about himself at that point was, I was playing a non-cooperative game vis-a-vis von Neumann. In other words, so it worked for him.
By the way, these were guys who occupied themselves for hours and hours and hours and hours with three-dimensional chess and Kriegspiel, in which you can't see the board.
Chess. Yeah, I mean, there are many people in this room, I can see their face, who have played these things in the math common rooms of the great university.
For those who don't know, could you give us either a classic piece of game theory, either the prisoner's dilemma or the cat theorem? Sylvia or Rebecca?
You probably have heard the prisoner's dilemma. I can tell you what the Nash equilibrium is, because Nash actually won a Nobel Prize for this. It's a kind of way of cutting through the endless logical chain. I mean, everybody knows that most economic decisions involve interdependence, i.e., when Microsoft decides to do something, they take into account what their competitors are doing. This is elementary. But that doesn't get you very far, because how does one, in a mathematical and logical sense, cut through the endless chain of I think, that he thinks, that I think, that, I mean, there's no, and this is what the 21-year-old Nash managed to do in this dissertation, and his proposed solution, which turns out to be, really have substantially revolutionized economic theory. His solution was very, very simple. He said that that players didn't have to coordinate, they didn't have to consult, they didn't have to talk to each other, that they could act in complete isolation. They would choose their best strategy based on the assumption that others were choosing their best strategies as well. And that was a way of cutting through the cord. And in the real world, we can see that equilibrium is achieved. People do make decisions, markets do clear, and he explained how it could be done without, without any centralization or visible coordination. So that's a little piece of game theory, and that's why it turned out to be very, very useful to people trying to describe economic decisions and the behavior of markets where there isn't a central authority and there isn't overt coordination.
In terms of the great themes of art, though, deterrent theory, mutual assured destruction, the face-off, the nuclear face-off between the Soviet Union and the US. You could say that Reagan overthrew 30 years of nuclear doctrine by arguing with Star Wars that game theory, deterrent theory, mutual assured destruction was immoral, right?
I mean, that's an interesting thought. Yeah.
Switching gears.
But the difference is, look, it's not that mathematicians like von Neumann and Nash invented strategic thinking. And people have been thinking strategically, for centuries. But they analyzed the structure and saw what it was about that kind of thinking that, that made it work.
Robert, in Proof, your scientist, David, is into game theory, although we don't get into that directly, but his daughter, Catherine, it seems to me, and this really leapt out of the play after Barry and company let me read it, but then seeing it just, the way you all acted it, made this the more dramatic. His daughter, Catherine, sets up a kind of experiment, doesn't she, when she, it seemed to me anyway, when she first takes Hal, to bed, and the next morning sends him back upstairs with the key from the chain around her neck to the locked drawer in the attic where she's kept this amazing proof that she's worked out, even while her father downstairs has lost his powers. And she loses that game in the first round, right? But then she wins. And that's how the play is resolved. And Rebecca, Samuel Malick appears to be into some elaborate game experiments with his daughter and his late wife, and with Justin Childs. You talk about how each of them is playing a kind of game as to who's going to get the physics from the other, even and especially through sexual means. So you're all into game theory.
We novelists call it motivation.
Yeah, thank you. We journalists call it the nut graph. Did you think about this sort of game-playing element of what's going on, David?
I thought that I would have this kind of, in Hitchcock movies there used to be a MacGuffin, which was the thing that everyone was after. And I think Hitchcock played a kind of game with the audience, seeing how little information he could give out about the thing and still have you care that they were going to get it. So you could be chasing all over, the face of Mount Rushmore, never quite sure exactly what is this thing that they're trying to get, but you were still happy to watch till the end of the movie. And I guess I was trying to get some of that going in Proof, but I also thought, that part of what could happen would be a kind of argument about what kinds of proof there are. And there's obviously this rigorous mathematical proof that Hal is interested in. But there's I guess I was trying to draw an analogy between that and the more informal, maybe more intuitive proof that we require of people who we have relationships with. And, I guess that's a semantic connection. I wanted to ask you if you think there's any danger in taking a scientific concept and and using it as a metaphor, and how rigorous you need to be if you're bringing it in as a metaphor to something you write. Because I felt like I wanted to play with that a little bit, but I was also a little bit wary of having something with a rigorous actual specific meaning in a scientific field be used promiscuously in a debate on stage. On the other hand, I couldn't resist doing it. So.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, I can't resist either, and I worry about the same thing. The language is so, I just love the technical terms, and I'm constantly plundering them and using them as metaphors. But one of my books is called Strange Attractors, which is of course a term from chaos theory, and quantum entanglement, which is I use that metaphor heavily in this book. It's all about entanglement and hidden variables. They're beautiful. Virtual particles, ghost particles, quantum tunneling. I don't know. I can just go on and on.
Tell me more about that last one.
It's a gold mine. It's just a gold mine. It's very beautiful. The collapse of the wave packet. I don't know. Okay, stop. But it's it's beautiful language and very, very very suggestive. Why not? Here's my rule. I explain what it really means. I'm very strict about that, or I explain what what the strict technical sense is, and then I use it, and yeah, so.
Can't help it.
Yeah.
Tom Stoppard has a nice line in Arcadia about people fancying people who aren't supposed to be part of the plan. That is, he says, sex is the attraction that Newton left out. Ben, do you think of yourself as an unwitting player of a game in Pi in terms of the sequence between romance striking and then...
You mean in Proof? Or in
in
Pi?
Proof, what did I
Right.
say? Sorry.
As an unwitting player of a game?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. Well, with respect to his relationship with Catherine, or with respect to...
I was just so struck by the smile on her face, on Catherine's face, on Mary Louise Parker's face, and her... She seems to be in command of a game the morning after when she pulls this key off and tosses it to you. And you're in her power.
That interpretation had never occurred to me. But sometimes it's right for the actor's perception not to be the same as the audience's.
The game goes on.
Yes. I'm resisting saying touche now, and I don't even know why. It just seems apropos of the atmosphere. That, I think, is, in my opinion, some of the emotional heft of the play comes from that moment being almost completely free of games. Mm-hmm. And then the beauty of that somehow crumbling in the face of the other elements that David's put in play. So I would say at that moment that there are no games being played, quite the opposite. And that's one of the, that's part of why people empathize so deeply with Catherine.
So again,
so she's completely vulnerable at that point and not in command.
Right. You're with Stoppard, the attraction that Newton left out. In other words, it's not
right. Well, as much as I'd like to believe that she's under a sort of tremendous sexual spell,
thrall,
I would say it may even extend beyond that to having found some kind of partner that's an emotional partner, but also someone who, if maybe not her equal, is someone who can participate with her in the way that only her father could before. So I think, I mean, it's a, you'd have to ask Mary Louise, but the way I've always received it, it's got a lot of layers in it.
Right. Why don't we open things up a little bit at this point and invite some questions? And there are microphones here, and we'd ask folks who want to say something ask something to identify themselves as well.
I'm going to leap right up. My name is Joanne Lessner, and I do have a question for David. But before I ask it, my husband and I have written a musical about Andrew Wiles and the proving of Fermat's last theorem, which is called Fermat's Last Tango. And yes, there is a tango, and it's a three-way tango, actually, between the professor character who's based on Andrew Wiles, his wife, and the character of Fermat, who is a character in the musical. And the discussion about magic I found particularly interesting. Here I was faced with, it's really a wonderful story, as you all know, but how do you make dramatic a man in his attic for 7 years struggling with an idea? And I had the idea to extrapolate this persona of Fermat himself. I thought, what kind of jerk would write this kind of note in the margin of a book and leave it there for 350 years of posterity to struggle with? So I created this sort of sneering, foppish, arrogant, but charming persona of Fermat, who lives in the aftermath, which is where dead mathematicians go. And yeah, there are a couple of groaners in my show. And but listening to this discussion, it struck me that innately I knew that there had to be some element of magic, and it took this form of almost unreality. Pythagoras, Newton, Gauss, and Euclid are also residents of the aftermath. And I clearly sort of felt this need. Wiles himself didn't strike me necessarily as magical, but it seemed important to bring that in. And also the idea where you're talking about vocabulary, there's actually a song that the wife sings called Math Widow. She's a little irked at being left alone for 7 years, and she uses, the only way she can communicate with him is mathematical sexual metaphor. So this has been fascinating for me to hear what you've all been talking about. But I do have a question for David. I enjoyed your play tremendously. And I perceived, actually, and what I want to know is if this was a conscious thought on your part, that the first act was a statement of a theorem with that wonderful closing line of the first act, which I won't destroy for anybody who hasn't seen it, and that the second act seemed to me almost a proof of that theorem. And I'm just wondering if that was a conscious structural choice on your part, or if that's my mania.
I wish I could say it were a conscious structural choice, because that's really pretty brilliant. But it wasn't. But that's, thank you for saying that. I also, your show sounds great. We were under, when we moved to Broadway, we were under a lot of pressure to add musical numbers to the play, and we resisted it. So I'm glad to know there's another.
Well, thanks. It's actually playing at the York Theatre Company, November 21st to December 31st, and I do have flyers with me, so if anybody wants to come find me afterwards. But congratulations to you. I really think the play is tremendous.
Thanks.
Thank you. One here and then one there.
Yes, as you know, when I first read the play, I was wondering whether it was fair to John Nash to take his life while he's still living, and have a character that's modeled after him. And sort of, I guess, also you in writing the book, to what extent is it really fair to take someone's life and, make something like this out of it?
That's a great question. I should just say that Jean, I sent her the play pretty much blind after I finished the draft, because I wanted a mathematician to read it, and I knew that she was the head of the Association for Women in Mathematics, and she was kind enough to read it. She responded to an email from a total stranger and read this manuscript, which was extremely nice. I guess I didn't think that I was basing the character on John Nash, so it never occurred to me until later. I knew about Nash, and I knew that there was a guy who had been a brilliant mathematician who had gone mad as a young man. But I thought my character was different enough and drew on biographical information from enough other mathematicians that it didn't bother me. It did. I have to say, a little nervous when Sylvia came to the show, and you came with John Nash, and I was just nervous.
We took John and Alicia to see Proof, and they loved it, and I don't think there was, the slightest bit of discomfort at all.
Great.
Yeah. Well, he enjoyed all the lines and the whole thing.
I have to say, I felt very guilty when he came out of it that I had called him the Phantom of Fine Hall. I thought I thought I was sort of safe because people don't usually come out of schizophrenia. And although, my character wasn't based on him, I did feel bad about it. And then I remember in your book, he refers to himself as the Phantom, but yes, sort of in good humor. And so I felt, okay, well, maybe he's okay with this. But, I've been a bit worried about it, actually.
No, Nash that's one of the fabulous things about his recovery, is that one of the things that has kind of blossomed again is his wonderful sense of humor. Just to answer your question a little bit, my biography of Nash grew out of a story I wrote about Nash a couple of weeks after he won the Nobel Prize, and this was the first time that in print, his really inspirational story, both the recovery from an illness that people generally don't think anyone ever recovers from, and finally the recognition that he was so long overdue. In response to that story, which ran on the cover of the Sunday Business section, I got the most amazing letters, and they confirmed to me They were from people in economics and mathematics, and most of all, many people who themselves suffered from schizophrenia, had relatives with schizophrenia. And that response just convinced me that this was an incredibly inspirational story that was not just an important piece of American intellectual history, but was a story that lots and lots of people really were very moved by and inspired by. And I will tell you one anecdote that about one letter that I got from someone who was at the New York Times, a very rising young editor. He was on the night desk on the Metro section in the 1970s, and he had a family. He was an Air Force captain, and the brilliant career ahead of him. He had a massive psychotic breakdown, and in the 25 years until I got this letter from him, he had been a street person in Berkeley suffering from the same illness as John Nash. He wrote me a letter which ended with that reading the story of Nash has given me the hope that one day the world will come back to me too. And so it really felt like this was a story that should be told.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'd like to come back to this.
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, my name is Bob Osserman, and this question of mathematical genius correlation with insanity I've talked to various people about today. And this, somebody must have done a study, I don't know. In my personal lifelong experience, when I've known lots of mathematicians, I've known some who, yes, I knew John Nash and I've known others, but I know far more people who are not mathematicians and not artists and not poets and not anything, but who have mental breakdowns. And I don't know what the correlation is, but actually I went back and I was rereading Bruce Weber's review of Proof, and I realized that there's a much more subversive thing going on, not just this correlation. Here's what he says, I guess talking about the daughter, Catherine. She has witnessed firsthand the jumble that mathematics can make of a working brain. So he is either responding to something in the play, which I would like to ask David Auburn whether he felt that this was something that's being said in the play, but more importantly, he's responding to something that's definitely out there because it occurs in Pi very strongly. The idea that this older mathematician had to stop doing mathematics because if he went back toward it, it's going to rot his brain. And the question of the young man also and trying to talk him out of it. And I don't know if some of you have come across a book that's surprisingly done recently fairly well. It's called Uncle Petros and Goldbach's Conjecture. And the same thing happens there. There is this character in it who is working on this really hard problem, and the fear that, oh, if he really gets back and works on it, it'll go crazy, and the implication is that it does. So there's something out there, and I'd really be interested in all your feelings about this subject, this particular question.
Well, it does seem that there's a high correlation between mathematicians and eccentrics, right? There is, again, this is just my personal observations, having spent most of my life.
So I was going to say the same thing about actors. That's funny.
and novelists. I mean, perhaps, all people who have to be somewhat obsessed to do their work, who have to be single-minded. But I did once read a study that there is a very high correlation between eccentricity and mental health, as a matter of fact. That eccentric, either, and it's not clear which way the causality goes, whether it takes a certain kind of confidence and strength of character to be true to your eccentricities, or whether or not eccentricity is actually healthy. So which way the causality goes. But I can vouch, having spent the greater part of my in fact, my entire adult life in the company of mathematicians and such. Yeah, they tend to be eccentric. And that might mislead people into, imputing insanity to them. But I think also their minds do work differently. I mean, it's quite mysterious to most people. I mean, there's this phenomenon of the prodigy. There's they do amazing things, and the fact that their minds work so differently from most people, and in a way that's inaccessible to most people. Most people, you talk to them about mathematical beauty, and it's like, what can you possibly be talking about? So that there's a world that they inhabit that's quite inaccessible to other people, might also encourage this view of the high correlation between mathematicians and insanity. I myself think it's probably false, but it's damn interesting when it happens again, and it's very dramatic. So we're drawn toward it, and maybe just a little old envy. People would like to be able to, here are people who are so in some parameter, in some direction, are so clearly superior. The kind of leveling off and saying, well, but they're mad. They can't possibly be having good lives like we are. So there might be a bit of that too.
Sylvia, David, Ben, do you want to add anything?
I agree. It's a comforting thought.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I'm Sylvan Capel. I was thinking of perhaps on this question about mathematics and madness, if I could get your thoughts getting away from the clinical here a little bit and the medical. If there isn't some, in all of your works, as I think about them, some metaphor that's implicit in them. Again, going back to mathematical ideas of metaphor. Mostly, of course, people think of mathematics as a metaphor for rationality, which is for rational behavior, and as a paradigm for it, which is what our first panel earlier today dealt with. But there is another view of it, which in a way is kind of implicit in a line of G.K. Chesterton's I like, which is that madmen are distinguished by their confidence in long chains of reasoning. And isn't there that aspect of mathematics that sort of is a metaphor in all your works, that to say that that we all know that if you apply long chains of reasoning in real life as opposed to mathematics, well, you're kind of crazy. And so there is that tension between the fact that it's a paradigm for rationality, and on the other hand, it's, in that sense, so inapplicable to the vicissitudes of life. And I sort of felt that that's in all of your works, and not just the clinical and the individual, but that sort of paradigm. So I'd like to get your views on that.
Well, I guess, I've changed my mind. I do think mathematicians are all totally barking mad. That's just today's experience. And, I think the next play will try to confront that. No, I do think that there's, as I said before, there's no real correlation, and it is an irresistible dramatic kind of trope. And also, there have been, a number of prominent mathematicians, Kurt Gödel, I guess, Georg Cantor, and Nash, most famously, who have suffered from madness. So it's a recurring theme that, if you have a kind of casual interest in it as a non-specialist, it jumps out at you and it's hard to resist.
I mean, another strange sort of merging, mathematics is seen as extreme rationality, but it also can have a kind of mystical overtones. And mathematicians speaking about their work as, a kind of discovering of this supra-sensible, Platonic world of, eternity, timelessness, untouched by, it takes on an almost mystical, ecstatic tone, and going back to Plato, and that's a sort of also strange tension that this most rational, logical study carried to the absolute extreme leads to a kind of almost mystical bliss, and maybe that encourages people to see them as mad. But no, or maybe that's just a totally different tension that seems odd and very, for me, very suggestive and inspiring, actually.
you have also the, 30, 40, 50 years ago, the spectacle of Einstein, the most brilliant man ever, and some people like him who, at least arguably, perhaps because of what they'd accomplished in splitting the atom, evolved into a kind of political, almost simple-mindedness. I mean, their politics was sort of peace now, and their suggestions for how to achieve it were at least arguably rather simple-minded. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Miriam Hecht. I'm certainly not a mathematician, but I've been involved at the periphery of mathematics for a good many years. I saw the play over the weekend, and I could recognize in the dialogue what was meant by Hal's claim that his work was run-of-the-mill, whereas her father's work had been, to borrow a word, ecstatic, because I've moved in those circles. But I found myself wondering, and this is perhaps the wrong audience to ask, what did it mean to somebody who knows nothing about mathematics and indeed finds it distasteful? Was it a little but like somebody being tone deaf, being told, yeah, people get excited about music, and all they could say is, yeah, I guess so.
I don't know. What's the question?
I'm not sure.
Let him ask the question.
Anybody want to take that on? No.
No, and I hope that you get the sense from the play that they have more in common than just their profession, and that there's a genuine spark between them that's not that they wouldn't spend their entire lives together working on that.
Ben spoke eloquently to that point, knocking down my theorem. Let's see, I think you were up first.
I was first. I go back to my generation. When Lee Strasberg came back from Moscow and gave a marvelous lecture to the group theater and also the Federal Art Theater. I'm an artist. I belong to the Artists Union in the 30s, WPA period. Now, as you know, that period contributed a great deal to the American culture. It was a renaissance in every form. How much your generation is gaining, or my generation of the 30s, was a golden period. You know what we produced in the arts, theater, in every form. I see I have the Sloan Foundation is helping out. We had the federal government helped us out. I've done a mural, I want to give you my history. I've done a mural in the Bellevue Hospital, one of the largest murals in the United States by the federal government. I made $27.50 a week and became a national monument, approved by the City Art Commission, and so the theater was a national monument all over the country. This is my experience as an artist. And the last thing, ladies and gentlemen, Moore Schwartz called me in after the war. He cried. He said, David, I speak yesterday of theater. I have documents I could show you what I have left over. He says to me, David, you contribute so much to the Jewish theater. What could you do right now? The Yiddish language disappeared. A little bit left over. Maybe we could survive something. He raised $300, and I worked a great deal. I done posters for him, and this is the end of a great theater, the Jewish theater. You contribute so much. Now, what do you have now? I hear I'm not a mathematician. I'm connected right now with the New York University, the computer division. I paint music, I paint science. I have here a gentleman, he saw some of my work. I'm connected right now with Professor Peacock, Professor Rowe. I'm painting right now. I still go on. I'm 90 years old. I'm here because to me it's beautiful to see people interested in the American culture. Beautiful what you're doing, no question about it.
Thank you.
So,
thank you.
Could you answer me, what approach are you going national, like my generation did it? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
So Josh Holden from Rutgers University. When you choose to use scientists or mathematicians as the main characters in your works now, which hasn't been done until recently very much, and inevitably wind up focusing on the math or the science to some degree, do you have a fear that you're going to be leaving the general public behind, or that you need to make concessions to the public and to worry about not turning people off when you feature these sort of esoteric subjects in your books and plays?
Directed to me?
To everyone, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do want to give people somewhat a feel of what it's like, not just for the people who care so much about it, but what they're caring about. And I do, for me, I mean, the reason I loved math and physics in the first place was because of its structural beauty. And it's a kind of form that's always in my mind that I'm trying to approximate in my own writing. I mean, structural, formal beauty is very important to me in my literary writing. I've been deeply influenced through my study of math, and I want to give people a sense, something of that, of the kind of beauty that exists in this world, and that not everybody has been fortunate enough to partake of and to enjoy, because, well, why not? Any beauty that exists in this world, we should be grateful for and should try to present. So I do, there is that sense in which I try to embody formal structures. And yes, it's a risk. It's a risk, yes. It's always a risk to write anything that requires great attention in our age. But it's, it's a risk I want to take.
I guess my first goal is to try to tell a story that's dramatically compelling, and I have faith, I think, that if I do that, then the audience will come along for whatever else is presented as part of that story.
It's been a long and exciting day, but I think we've got time for just one more question.
I wanted to direct it to Ben, who I thought did a good job being a young mathematician, having spent my life surrounding them, and I wondered if you did anything special.
If I did anything special to discover how to be that?
To seem like a mathematician, or did you just guess?
I don't think I did anything special. A lot of it's on the page. That's the truth of it. One of the things that's fun about acting is that sometimes you read something that someone has created, and if they've created it well, you just get it. You just understand it. You see it in your mind's eye. And then just through the process of doing it, what happens is that all your perceptions of all the people that you've encountered kind of subconsciously bubble up, and the right qualities. You seem to find the right qualities. You seem to find the body of the character. I mean, some of it's ingrained, but I played a lot of things other than guys like that, and so I don't think it's just I don't think it's necessarily about your matching the character. The fun part is how that part of you that's like the character matches with, as I said before, the things that you've just been subconsciously taking in your whole life. When something's well written, just by doing it really, those two things come together and you wind up, you know, moving towards a characterization that you can believe yourself, that feels like you, and people watching it believe that it is like you. So I'm very glad that that worked, but I guess my point is it's really a testament first and foremost to the writing.
Sylvia, Rebecca, David, Ben, thank you very, very much for wonderful discussion.